The first U.S. president to live in the White House was the second U.S. president. It was John Adams. John Adams moved into the White House in November of the year 1800. Before that, while he was president, but before he moved into the White House, before the White House was complete, John Adams lived in Philly. Both John Adams, the nation's second president, and George Washington, the nation's first president, they both lived in Philadelphia in the 1790s while the U.S. Capitol and the White House were being built in D.C. And that house in Philadelphia, where both George Washington and John Adams lived while they each served as president, that house has a really interesting story. Accidentally, the last remaining walls of that house were, by accident, torn down in the 1950s. That was the last standing portion of the house. It was accidentally demolished in the 1950s. Decades later, once archaeologists and historians figured out for sure where that president's house had been, the city got involved. They bought the land, they preserved everything they could, and ultimately that site was reopened as a National Historic Site. Today it is sort of an open-air pavilion where you can see the shape of the president's house. You can see the foundations of the original building. They've got artifacts there from the time that George Washington and John Adams lived in that house. And while John Adams, who was from Massachusetts, while Adams was not a slaveholder, George Washington was. George Washington had 8 people who were enslaved to him, who he brought from Virginia to that house in Philadelphia to serve him while he was president. He later brought an additional enslaved person from Virginia to Philadelphia to that house, making it a total of 9. And that is all part of the history there at this historic site in Philadelphia. Now, you've probably heard about the fact that over this past year, President Donald Trump ordered the physical removal of all references to slaves and slavery at that National Historic Site. Well, today, a big change in that case. Today, happy President's Day, a federal judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania ordered that the Trump administration must put those references to slaves and slavery back up. The judge in the case is a Republican appointee from the George W. Bush administration, and she starts her remarkable ruling today with a quote from 1984 from George Orwell. She then says, quote, "As if the Ministry of Truth in George Orwell's 1984 now existed with its motto, 'Ignorance is strength,' this court is now asked to determine whether the federal government has the power it claims to dissemble and disassemble historic truths when it has some domain over historical facts. It does not." Honestly, this is your President's Day present this year, this ruling. Let me give you a little bit more from it. The President's meeting, that site in Philadelphia, represents the city of Philadelphia fulfilling an obligation to tell the truth, the whole complicated truth. Removal of the crucial interpretive materials there strips that site of that truth and deprives the public of educational opportunities designed to be free and accessible. The abrupt elimination of historically significant educational material at the site is like pulling pages out of a history book with a razor. Each person who visits the president's house in Philadelphia and does not learn of the realities of founding-era slavery receives a false account of this country's history. Worse yet, the judge says, worse yet, the potential of having the exhibits replaced by an alternative script, a plausible assumption at this time, would be an even more permanent rejection of the site's historical integrity. It would be, quote, irreparable. The city has met its burden to establish irreparable harm. The defendants, the Trump administration, for their part, raise only one argument for why an injunction in this case would be inequitable. They argue that there's a public interest in upholding the federal government's right to convey its preferred speech. Restoration of the president's house in Philadelphia does not infringe upon the government's free speech, nor is the government prevented from conveying whatever message it wants to send by wiping away the history of the greatest founding fathers' management of persons he held in bondage. President Washington's house would not merit designation as a historic site if Washington had not commanded the army that won the Revolutionary War. His presence presiding over the Constitutional Convention graced it with the gravitas and spirit necessary to the creation of our government's foundational document. Washington's restraint and modesty radiated strength and wisdom that defines the ideal chief executive to this day. The government can convey a different message without restraint elsewhere if it so pleases, but it cannot do so to the president's house, not until it follows the law and consults with the city. The motion for preliminary injunction will be granted. Happy President's Day, Philadelphia. You are getting your history put back up by court order at the president's house.